Hey folks, welcome to the special version of the runZero Hour. This time we're going to talk about the runZero Research Report, the first volume. This report was the end result of the whole research team getting together and doing a lot of analysis, and we've got some fun things to share. The folks behind this report are Rob King, our Director of Security Research, who will also be on this session, as well as myself, Tom Sellers, and Blaine Smith. If you'd like to read the full report instead of hearing us talk, you can get it from the website. And yeah, so to start with, why do we do this? Well, runZero has a very different perspective of the world than a lot of vendors. We're able to analyze data that's typically behind the firewall. So we see a lot of organizations behind the firewall in the cloud environments, in their mobile environments. And so it's a little bit different from like an outside-in scan compared to looking at something like census data or Shodan data, because we're seeing things that are typically not exposed directly to the internet. So we did a representative sample across all the data in our public cloud. This included about 50 million data points, about 4 million different assets, and over 17,000 unique fingerprints. And we want to talk a little bit about what we found and some of the cool things that popped out of it.
And one of the cool things that popped out of it was the sheer amount of OT devices that are exposed to the public internet. So IT and OT are converging. This is actually something that was stated by the government in the NSTAC report to the president back in 2022, that IT and OT convergence will be the end state of things. And this, has obvious benefits. It makes these devices easier to manage, easier to monitor, but it also makes them more accessible for good and for bad. And so what we saw in our data set was that about 7% of these devices are exposed to the public internet. And that has actually been holding steady. It's gone down a little bit in the United States, but it's going up in the rest of the world. And these devices tend to not be particularly focused on security. They tend to have relatively simple authentication models, security models, things like that. And so having these exposed to the public internet is a fairly serious concern. For example, we see here we've got several programmable logic controllers and Ethernet gateways and various other industrial devices. And it would actually be kind of neat to show how you would look for that in runZero itself. So if we jump over, you can see with this query, type PLC or type industrial control or type building automation, these are all devices that probably shouldn't be exposed to the public internet. And you can see there are actually quite a few that we can show here, 244 in this public data set. Schneider Electric PLCs, you see Microsoft Windows running on embedded devices, Siemens logo PLCs, really a lot of devices that are just out there and visible and connectable. Devices are not generally particularly powerful in terms of processing capabilities. They tend to be some years, sometimes even decades old. And so for a long time, active scanning was considered to be fairly dangerous on these devices because active scanning can cause CPU spikes, can cause denials of service, and inadvertently can cause crashes, things like that. And as you can see here, this is a screenshot from a OT device being scanned by someone other than runZero, and you can see that the CPU is pegged at 100%. But active scanning is possible, and runZero has spent an immense amount of research on finding ways to do this as safely as possible. And so this diagram sort of illustrates the process. What we do is we will send probes in stages, and we'll start with the known safe, generally safe probes. We send those probes out, we get some feedback, and we're able to narrow down what devices it could possibly be. And we send the next stage of probes and we narrow it down further. And anytime we've determined that it isn't safe to send a probe to this device because of something we've seen earlier, then we simply don't send the probe, we stop probing. And we are able to therefore safely sort of tease out as much information as possible. We also have done a lot of research into making sure we don't send too much traffic. We can send as little as 1 packet per second. And we've done an immense amount of research in how we can protect the intermediary devices as well. So we're not just making sure we're scanning safely these endpoint devices, but the routers and switches and industrial protocol gateways in between them we also make sure to manage our state and our traffic very well there to keep those devices as safe as possible. And these devices, it's interesting because these devices often are, just as they don't have necessarily very robust authentication mechanisms or whatever, and it's nothing wrong with that. That's how they were designed. They have a different set of constraints. They also tend to not have a lot of security tooling around them necessarily. And so we've done some research into the concept of an outlier. And an outlier, we borrowed the term from statistics. An outlier is a device that differs significantly from the other devices in the same site, in the same network. And so we compute a baseline across many different metrics, across many different dimensions, a baseline of devices. And if there is a common baseline, we then will check to see how far removed from that baseline each device is. And so what we've discovered, if you look at this graph, is that the outlier score is strongly predictive of the risk rank. And the risk rank is calculated based on how risky or vulnerable an asset is computed to be based on runZero source data, third-party source data, things like that. And this is useful, one, because it lets you figure out which device is unusual and you may need to take a closer look at, but also is very useful for devices where there maybe isn't a strong or a mature security tooling in place. So you can say, oh, well, this device is unusual. It is most likely risky. And this graph illustrates that by showing that there's a very strong correlation between the outlier score and the risk rank. And we can actually see that live if we go to the runZero console and simply sort by risk. And you can see here, medium risk, the outliers too. Look what happens if we sort by the outlier score and then sort by risk. Everything here, we have a much more critical, high, medium, with these outlier scores being generally above 1. And when we sort the other way with risk, you can see that if there's no risk set, there's generally also not an outlier higher than 1. So the outlier score tends to be strongly predictive of that risk rank. And that lets you have a good proxy measurement to discover what assets might be worth focusing on further. Another thing that we've really looked into in depth is the concept of assets and software and components that have reached their end of life date. And so end of life, it's usually split into two sorts of things. So end of life means that the asset is no longer being actively developed by the vendor. There's generally not going to be new features released, new versions released, things like that. And then some vendors also have what's called an extended end of life. And so when an asset is still in the extended end of life, that is the date prior to which you'll still get security updates, critical features, things like that, but they don't usually get new features or new versions released unless there's something critical that needs to come out. Oftentimes those two dates are the same, sometimes they're different. And we've discovered that there's still a significant portion of systems out there that are past their end of life dates. You can see here that a significant portion of Windows 10 is past its extended end of life. About 28% is that particular version of Windows. Windows Server 12 still makes up about 12%. And these systems are relatively old, but what's nice is you can actually detect this and search for this pretty easily in runZero. We can go back here and look at our data and say, the OS EOL expired keyword, say OS EOL expired true, and you can see that in fact there's several systems. Some of these expired 6 years ago, 4 years ago, 9 years ago, quite a large number of systems that have expired operating systems past their EOL date. And this is something you can search for very easily in runZero and is tracked there. But it's not just the operating system that has an EOL date. The hardware as well often has a separate EOL date, at which point You're not going to get the hardware. The model will no longer be supported. And then what's really interesting is components in the software. So just because the operating system is updated, that operating system or that application or that firmware may incorporate third-party components that have their own distinct end-of-life dates. And one thing that's really interesting about runZero, because it's doing this scanning and this traffic sampling, it can look at what's actually communicating on the wire and identify the software. And we took as a case study the BOA web server, which is an embedded web server that's very common in a lot of IoT devices. And the BOA web server has not been updated in quite some time, close to a decade. And yet we still see this everywhere, including in devices where their operating system or their firmware has not reached its end of life. So the operating system is still supported. These devices are still out there. All of the devices in this data set were live within the past 60 days. And yet they're running this embedded web server that has not been updated in quite some time. And so just because the operating system is updated doesn't necessarily mean that the parts of the software that are talking on the network or the parts of the software that are reachable by attackers have been updated. And so it's nice to be able to have that view inside and behind the curtain to see these components and what's actually there, the truth on the ground. And HD has a, I'm going to give it back to HD for a second. He has a funny, interesting story about that, in fact.
What's interesting is that even though the BOA web server hasn't been updated in 10 years, there also haven't been a lot of new vulnerabilities reported in the software. If you look for like CVEs and BOA, you just don't see a lot of new stuff in the last 8, 9 years. That doesn't mean they aren't there, it just means no one's looking for them. So what we did is we kind of went back in time, if you will. We took a modern fuzzing toolkit, AFL++, and then applied that to this ancient web server stack and just threw it out overnight to see what would pop out and immediately found all kinds of fun bugs. So the one here isn't particularly significant. It's just I think it's like a out of bounds read, so it doesn't actually cause any problems. But it's a good example of like, even though this software is old and even though there's no recent vulnerabilities in it, that's just because no one's actually looking for them right now. And if you start applying modern security tools to these older software stacks that are still being shipped in production devices today, you start finding all kinds of fun stuff.
And those devices, in fact, oftentimes make up something that we've called network dark matter. And we borrowed that term from cosmology, where dark matter is this matter whose influence can be observed, right? Its gravitational influence can be observed, but it's not directly observable. It's not visible, as it were. And so we've sort of created three buckets. One are the devices that are heavily managed, that are interacted with every day. So these are your desktops, your laptops, things like that. Things that are definitely on IT's radar. They're getting updates automatically, often en masse, and people will notice if something is going on with them. And then you've got, to a lesser extent, these devices with limited visibility. And these devices are still there and people recognize them and things like that, but they're not super common. These are maybe wireless access points and smaller devices that come and go, IP phones, things like that. And then you have the network dark matter. And the network dark matter is the stuff that security teams and IT teams wouldn't necessarily notice if they vanished or changed. They are very rarely upgraded. Sometimes you can't even upgrade them at all, even if you wanted to. And they may be running firmware that's years out of date, but is still on the network. And these are things like thermostats, aquarium pumps, projectors, in break or in meeting rooms, things like that, coffee pots. And we discovered that of the physical assets on networks in our data set, around 19% of them were these dark matter devices, these devices that may not be updated. You might not notice them. You might not even know to go look for them. So it's really fascinating that we're able to go in there and find these devices and find just the sheer number of them. And what's interesting is that these devices, oftentimes being on the network, can do all sorts of things with IP traffic that I think HD would like to talk about now.
So the general practice in security is that if you have a device you can't secure, you can't really get rid of it. You just put it in its own little box. What's happened over time is that we've started to use network segmentation as kind of our one and major tool for putting insecure devices out of harm's way. Unfortunately, we now typically put all those devices in the same bucket of bad devices, and the effectiveness of segmentation is starting to fall apart. What we're seeing is not just a kind of overuse of segmentation, but also that a lot of devices are multi-homed and are routing packets by default, and as a result, you can actually bypass segmentation fairly easily as a result. So your typical network was of, 10 years ago, you may have your DMZ and some devices directional facing up here in the top left. You may have your wireless guest network along with your printers and other kind of junk you don't care quite as much in the bottom right. Then you have more of your core enterprise network, all the machines that are plugged into the Ethernet, your databases, your internal SharePoints, things like that. So this is how folks would normally think of the network. However, when you start looking at how these devices actually work, ends up almost everything's a router. A huge portion of all printers, a huge portion of all network storage devices are both multi-homes and they enable IP traffic routing by default. So what we did is we enabled an IP forwarding check and runZero. And so we every time you run a runZero scanning, it's a local network segment. We actually probe every single device local segment. Says, hey, can you route a packet to the internet? And if so, try it. But try it with a really low TTL and tell us if you fail to reach the endpoint. So what we noticed is that a huge number of devices will forward traffic by default. This allows someone to bypass things like layer 2 port locking. So if you're in the same network segment as a printer and you want to route traffic through the printer, you just point your router at the printer and the printer forwards your traffic. If your printer is multi-home, like let's say it is like almost every other printer these days and has Bluetooth, it has Wi-Fi enabled by default, and it has Ethernet, well, somebody out in the parking lot may be able to connect to your printer and then actually treat your printer like a router to get into your wired network. And that's pretty common. Another interesting point is these often have the IPv6 on by default, which means that not only can you route V4 traffic, but you can often route through V6 and then use all kinds of fun tricks like routing advertisements, things like that to take over these devices and redirect their outbound traffic, even from a less secure segment. Another surprising fact was that a lot of workstations actually route traffic by default as well. And we're like, well, why is that? We started trying to figure out why is a random, Mac OS or Linux desktop enabling IP forwarding by default? Ends up a lot of the container stacks. If you're running Docker, you're running Podman, you're running a lot of virtualization toolkits, they enable IP forwarding by default so that you can talk to your bridged interfaces of your virtual machines. Unfortunately, because there's no IP tables rules enabled by default, it also routes traffic between different segments. So, if you're a developer and you're plugged into your corporate Ethernet on one side, but you're still joined to the wireless network on the other, your machine's effectively a router between those two segments. So you're effectively breaking segmentation for your organization. So the challenge with segmentation is that it fails really quickly. It's pretty fragile and it's really difficult to verify. So effectively, when you start looking at how networks actually operate, all those network segmentation boundaries start falling apart. In this case, we've got a machine on the left side that's part of the core wired network that's still connected to the wireless on the guest network. You've got someone out in the parking lot connected to your printer through its wireless, and they're therefore access to that particular network. So segmentation starts falling apart really quickly. And this is a very simplified version. A slightly bigger organization will be on the next slide. And this is an example of a company of about 100 employees. Like it's not that large number of employees, but you can see every device has multiple interfaces, multiple networks. They're all cross-connected. You start playing like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon here to get from any point to another, and you can bypass almost any segmentation fairly trivially because there's just so many connection points. If you're running a Windows machine, Mac OS, or even an iPhone, and you list the interfaces on your machine at the kind of low level, you do an ifconfig on Mac or Windows, you'll notice there's a ton of interfaces you probably don't recognize. A default Mac OS machine running like on a MacBook Pro has something like 17 interfaces out of the box. That includes the wireless display link, that includes all the Bluetooth stuff, you name it. So lots and lots of interfaces, and they're all enabled by default. So this was a very small example. If we start looking at like what a slightly bigger company looks like, let's say 300 employees, it turns into a spaghetti ball really quick. It's almost impossible not to find a way to bypass segmentation. And this is more of the expectation than the exception. This is a fairly common problem across the board, and we don't see folks really taking that seriously yet.
And you can actually find these devices by using runZero and looking for the IPv4 forwarding or IPv6 forwarding attribute. And you can see here in the runZero lab, we have all sorts of devices that are capable of forwarding traffic. Some of them are, not surprising. We've got some switches and all that. We also have things like network attached storage. We have a home pod. We have a few devices that you wouldn't necessarily expect being able to break your segmentation. A power device, all these devices, video encoder, are capable of routing traffic, uh, and you wouldn't necessarily know it, and therefore potentially capable of breaking your network segmentation.
So over the last few years, we've seen a big change in terms of how threat actors gain access to networks. So the good news is that all the phishing training, all the endpoint protection, all the browser hardening has gone a long way to making that path into the environment a lot more difficult. So what we're seeing instead is, like always, attackers pick the weakest link. And what's become the weakest link are now all of your edge-facing devices. So your file transfer systems, your VPN gateways, even a lot of your security appliances that are exposed to the network on the outside, they've now become the easiest point of entry into your environment. And what's really been really tricky lately is that we see a lot of vulnerabilities in these products being exploited in the wild before the vendor's aware of them. Customers scramble to figure out, okay, do I have these things? Where are they? Where are they facing? And oftentimes the vendor doesn't have a patch, that day. They often don't even patch that week, and in some cases don't even patch that month. So we're seeing a much more frequent use of zero-day vulnerabilities to break into organizations outside-facing equipment. And this has been probably the number one driver of things like ransomware and extortion attempts in the last 6 months. So the attackers are consistently staying ahead of both the vendors and the defenders. I don't want to pick on too many vendors here, but we'll just take the Cisco example. So Cisco had a vulnerability in the Cisco iOS XE operating system, which is a Linux-based version of iOS. It has a web server you can use to configure it just like any other version of iOS. You can enable the web server or not. However, if that web server was exposed to an attacker, they can use two different bugs together, one to create an unprivileged user, another one to then get root access using that unprivileged user. By the time the advisory was even posted, before anyone was even aware of the vulnerability and the initial advisory was posted, it was estimated that 10,000 machines had already been compromised based on IOCs. The advisory itself on day one said, here's the IOCs to look for to see whether you've already been backdoored. And you never want your initial disclosure from a vendor to tell you how to look for the backdoors that may already be present. So this is being actively exploited well before anyone knew about it, including the vendors and definitely not the people running the products. What was tricky about those is that it took a couple weeks for the patches to come out. So by the time the patches arrived, the estimate was that over 50,000 devices had been backdoored even before a patch was available. So obviously you can take mitigation steps. You can disable the web server. You can try to find it. You can generally keep ahead on the exposure front. But this is starting to become the norm. You're starting to see more and more zero-day attacks against external facing devices. And even when they affect security equipment, like the Palo Alto issue recently, you don't necessarily get a patch out within 24 hours, let alone a week in some cases. So expect this to be the new normal going forward. And the only way to really respond to this stuff is to know where your technology is. So, of course, there's no point doing a vulnerability scan for a device when there's no patch available. Obviously, there's no patch. Your vuln scanner, your patch check isn't going to tell you anything useful. Instead, what you need to know is where is that technology, where is it exposed, and how do I mitigate it that second?
And something else that we noticed, the big news of the year, was the executils backdoor. And so executils, for those who aren't familiar, is a suite of compression utilities and a library that implements the algorithms involved, the compression algorithms involved. And this is an open source project. It's used in a lot of different things. It's used in pretty much, it's distributed by default pretty much on any Linux system, a lot of BSDs, a lot of Mac OS, all sorts of things. And through a multi-year social engineering campaign, an attacker was able to was granted access to the source code repository of this system and was able to commit changes, and then would commit seemingly good changes until they pulled the trigger and implemented a very well designed and very well hidden backdoor. And this backdoor specifically was targeting Linux systems running the systemd init system init management daemon and SSH, OpenSSH. And it would allow an attacker with the appropriate key to access these systems, run arbitrary commands without any authentication. And this was a remarkably interesting attack, but it was definitely a huge, huge deal. And it was discovered at just the last possible moment before it. If it had been discovered even just a week or two later, it would have made it out to millions more systems. And so runZero, we had a long weekend, and runZero tried to figure out the best way to detect these systems. So it made it into a few rolling releases, beta releases, testing releases for major Linux distributions. And it appears on the network to be like any other SSH server. And it's not necessarily, because these tend to be these testing systems and these rolling releases and things tend to often be stood up temporarily or just part of sort of the shadow IT of an organization. It's not necessarily something that's going to be visible immediately to IT. And saying something like, find all the Linux systems running SSH isn't really a viable strategy because most Linux systems will be running SSH. So what we did was we leaned on runZero's excellent fingerprinting technology, and we compiled a huge spreadsheet and were able to determine what Linux kernel versions were present in the versions of these Linux distributions that were affected and what their SSH banners would look like and things like that. And then we're able to write this query here to say, okay, if systems running this query are capable, are running versions of the Linux kernel that map to, because it had to be a fairly recent version of the kernel and various other things, map to these releases, these distributions of Linux that are potentially compromised. And that was a huge, huge win because it reduced the set of systems that might need to be investigated from thousands down to about 30. So it was a really, really fascinating thing. And that was thanks to the very in-depth fingerprinting that runZero is capable of doing. And in fact, runZero does some really interesting stuff with fingerprinting operating systems based on how they communicate on the network. So how they communicate their various features and parameters that are set in the TCP stack on these systems, for example. And we're able to identify very granularly what version of what operating system they're running. And then oftentimes we can even map them to the upper level distribution. So not just the Linux kernel, but also what version of CentOS or what distribution in general. And it's also really fascinating. Something that I really love about this is that this is often done with only a single packet. So it's not just fingerprinting, it's also fingerprinting very efficiently, not sending out too much traffic on your network. And so you can see here, we're actually able to get down to a very specific, oftentimes even just point releases of these systems, of these Linux distributions based solely on how they communicate on the network, which is a really, really useful tool, especially if it's something that's part of the so-called shadow IT organization where you might not otherwise know about it. And the back door that we were mentioning was talking using SSH. And SSH is the secure shell. It is the de facto administrative protocol for Unix, Linux systems, BSD systems, often deployed on Windows now as well. And it is secure, but it only is secure if you configure it properly, just like anything else. And what we discovered in our data set was that around 92% of systems running SSH are still accepting password authentication. And SSH can support password authentication, it can support public key authentication, it can support various other things, but usually it's password, public key, and then keyboard interactive, which can sometimes be used to do other things, but is almost always simply just another, it simply uses the password authentication again. And public key authentication is by far the most secure and is absolutely what is recommended. And we do see that a lot of systems are using public key authentication, but they still have password authentication enabled. And it's strongly recommended that once you've enabled public key authentication, that you then disable password authentication, but we do not see that being the case. And so that leaves these systems open to password guessing attacks and brute force attacks. And something else that we noticed that was really interesting is SSH supports the concept of a host key. And a host key is another public-private key pair that uniquely identifies the system that is running the SSH server. And this is important because it lets you be confident that you are in fact speaking to the system you think you're speaking to. There's not a machine in the middle that is logging your keystrokes. You're not accidentally logged into a system that an attacker can then use to extract credentials or something like that. And so these host keys are ideally supposed to be unique to the system that they are on, that they are identifying. But we found that host key reuse is actually very common. You can see here we had one specific host key that was shared across 7,000 different systems. We had one on a storage appliance that was shared across 4,000 different systems. And so by doing that, it allows attackers to potentially fake what system you're communicating with. And we highly recommend that if possible, if you are going to have lots of templated systems, that you try to use SSH certificates or something else to still keep that unique identification of those systems. And HD, if you want to give the news on this one.
Sure. We're really excited that we're going to give a talk at Black Hat this year in Vegas. I think like October, probably, or sorry, August like 6th or 7th is probably when we get scheduled. This talk is focused on the SSH protocol and finding lots of fun ways to shell them. So we take the secure part out of SSH basically and talk about all the ways it breaks. One of the early findings we can talk about now is if you have a ruckus access point, please apply the latest update. Otherwise, remote route by auth bypass through SSH. And we'll be talking about lots of things around that. So the TLDR, I guess, is like if you're running OpenSSH in a modern good configuration, you're probably fine. But there's a lot of stuff out there running SSH that's horribly broken that no one was really aware of until we did this work.
Hope to all see y'all there. And speaking of encryption and encrypted protocols, we also did a lot of work into the transport layer security, TLS. Used to be known a long time ago as SSL. And so runZero does very in-depth fingerprinting based on the behavior of the TLS stack. So just like when we were talking about how we could see the BOA web server and other embedded pieces of software, we also can talk to the TLS stacks and see how they actually communicate on the wire. And that's important because systems might have 2 or 3 or 4 different TLS stacks running. They might have software written in Go and it's using the Go TLS stack, Java using the Java TLS stack, something else using the OpenSSL implementation, things like that. And so we are able to fingerprint what each individual service is using based on its behavior. And you can see here this beautiful RZFP0 is a fingerprint computed by runZero that is relatively resilient to vendor and admin tweaking as well. So even if there are some configuration changes or something like that, we can still generally identify what TLS stack is in use. And I always love that if you look at the TLS stack version below, you can see that we can even identify it within a fairly narrow range. So this was the Go crypto TLS. This is the TLS stack that's included in the Go standard library. And we were able to identify it down to a very narrow version range, which is super interesting because you can also, in the case of Go anyway, that is tied to the version of Go that the rest of the application is written in. So you can also see, that also gives you some information about how old that entire service might be. And so there's often, as I said, multiple TLS stacks in a system. Some of them, just like we were talking about end-of-life software, some of them were end-of-life, like OpenSSL 1.1 has been end-of-life for quite some time. And you can still see that about 15% of them are running in the wild. And so approximately 1 in 6 TLS endpoints are running an end-of-life TLS stack, which is interesting.
Well, thanks, Rob. So next, we'll talk a little bit about is remote desktop protocol. So you may recognize this protocol from admitting Windows machines. So just like you use SSH to manage remote Linux machines, you typically use RDP to manage remote Windows machines. It's kind of the standard. So RDP has kind of your standard authentication where you log into it or you connect to it. It presents a Windows desktop. You then type your username and password, and then you log in. This was the default until about 2008. After that point, Windows started to support NLA being network level authentication. And so what this does is it prevents people from even seeing the desktop until they authenticate. It effectively enforces the TLS communication layer first, and then after the encryption transport's negotiated, it then forces you to authenticate using NTLM, SSP, and then once you get past the authentication, then you get to the desktop itself. So for folks who are used to seeing like RDP screenshots on desktop or on Shodan, for example, anything with NLA enabled is not going to give you that screenshot by default anymore. What's interesting about this, though, is that even though enabling NLA reduced some of the information leak from the screenshot side, it actually has its own information leaks. the NLA part itself will leak the host name in the TLS cert. It'll also leak the domain name and the authentication, username, machine name, and whatnot, and the engine MSSP authentication first. So you can also you actually get a little bit more information in some cases than you did before, depending on how it's deployed. So the question is, if this is now the default in Windows 2008 and newer, what does it look like in the real world? Surprisingly enough, or unsurprisingly, I guess, Windows Server 2019, even though it has NLA enabled by default, a large portion of folks still disable NLA. They still make NLA optional, not required. They're often doing that for default compatibility to support older clients, older thin clients, things like that. But unfortunately, that means that a large portion of even the most modern versions that we sampled in this case, we're still not enabling NLA. And as you start kind of going down the line for older and older OSs, even 2008 R2, there's still a decent portion even most of 2008 R2 still does not require NLA. And of course, when you start getting older versions like 2003, it doesn't support NLA at all. Therefore, 100% of them effectively don't support NLA. So the defaults being on are useful, and they've really pushed the bar for security. But folks are actively making it less secure still for compatibility reasons. What's interesting though is that what about Linux? Well, ends up there's a large portion of Linux machines that run a RDP server. These tend to be the backend servers that support a VDI, thin clients, things like that. What's really surprising about it though is that the default RDP server on these Linux distributions does not support NLA. So XRDP does not support NLA at all. It's effectively the same security that you get from Windows 2003 RDP. Folks can get to the desktop before they authenticate effectively. They can see the UI, things like that. What's really strange though is that you don't see these on Shodan. And it took us a while to figure out what was going on. Ends up the protocol is just different enough for XRDP on Linux that the screenshot tool that Shodan uses can't actually grab a screenshot. So even though you don't see the RDP desktop screenshots on Shodan, they're actually not protected by NLA, and they're actually directly accessible. So kind of a strange side effect of how the protocol is implemented on the Linux side. So talking about dead protocols, SMB version 1 is kind of the original version of the server message block protocol. I think it was launched in sometime in like late 80s, early 90s. And it was last required, the version 1 was effectively last required by XP in 2000 and Server 2003. The protocol is kind of fundamentally broken. It doesn't really support authentication well. It allows you to do replay attacks. It doesn't have privacy built into the protocol. It was publicly deprecated by Microsoft in 2013, disabled by default in Windows 10 in 2019 as of 2017. And they also put out, Microsoft also put a patch out that would automatically turn off SMB version 1 when it wasn't in use over some period of time. So the idea is that it would say, okay, if you haven't done anything that required SMB version 1 in your environment, we're going to automatically disable it because you're not using it. So it's gone, right? Theoretically, no one's using SMB v1. So no, actually, it's everywhere still. So a quarter of Windows 10 machines still support it. A fifth of Windows of Server 2016 machines still support it, and almost every NAS device out there still supports it. All your Linux-based file servers turn it on by default. So the question is why? Why do you have modern versions of Windows that should have had it turned off by default still supporting SB version 1? Well, that little tidbit about Microsoft automatically disabling SB1 when it's not in use. Well, we're trying to figure out, well, what would be speaking SB version 1 in an environment that was all modern? Well, it ends up your vulnerability scanners themselves also speak SB v1 as part of the negotiation. So if during the sampling period that patch was enabled, any device tried to speak SB version 1 to it, including your vulnerability scanner, it would have actually convinced the device not to disable SB v1. So in a lot of ways, your vuln scanner created SB v1 exposure on your Windows desktops by the fact that it ran in the first place. So, I mean, obviously you can't just blame the vuln scanner, but it was kind of a funny side effect of how this all shook out. Awesome. Well, thanks for your time today. If you want to see the full report, you can get it at runzero.com/research-report. We'd love to see you at the Black Hat talk on SH if you can. And if you want to kick the tires at runZero, you've got a free trial, and we've got a free community version as well that you can use in your home lab or small business. If you want to get in touch, you can reach us at research@runzero.com or a Mastodon at runZeroInc at infosec.exchange.